The shrill sound of tearing paper cut through the hum of the airport terminal. Time froze. The conversations, the suitcases rolling, the mechanized voice overhead uttering its routine messages, all that came to a stop. Dozens of eyes turned towards the counter of first-class check-in. Samantha Wilson, 25, was a businesswoman who stood stock still, staring at the torn halves of her passport in the hands of the flight attendant. Her heart pounded in her chest, a dull roar rising in her ears. Karen Davis, the woman behind the counter, held the two pieces of the document between her fingers as if they were nothing more than scraps of trash. Her expression unreadable, her uniform crisp, her posture stiff with authority. "This passport looks fake," she said coldly, letting the torn halves flutter onto the counter like fallen leaves. It got electric all around them. The man standing in line made an audible gasp. The woman covered her mouth with her two hands. Somebody muttered, "No way," under the thick tension filling the terminal. Samantha's heart bashed hard into her ribcage. That wasn't a sheet of paper, it was an identity. That was a right to live and breathe and belong in that place. The only way to go home, and now it's ruined. A wave of emotions crashed over her in one fell swoop. Shock, denial, anger. She wanted to reach for the passport, to hold it together, as if that could somehow make what had just happened not have happened. But her hands shook against the cool surface of the counter. Karen barely acknowledged the reaction around her. Instead, she lifted her chin and straightened her already perfect posture. "We can't allow security risks on international flights," she added, as if explaining a minor inconvenience to an unruly passenger. A low, restless murmur swept the line. A middle-aged man in a navy blazer pressed forward, his voice incisive. "I saw her passport before you ripped it. It looked real to me." Another woman clutched the handle of her designer suitcase and shook her head. "You can't just destroy someone's passport. That's illegal, isn't it?" Phones were out now, cameras recording, the glow of screens reflecting off the varnished floor. Samantha swallowed and forced her breathing to even. She couldn't break down, not here and now. She fixed Karen instead with a steady gaze. "You just destroyed my legal identification," she said quietly but firmly. "You're going to have to answer for that." Karen just blinked. "If you've got a problem, you take it to security." Dismissive words. These were like a door slammed in Samantha's face, but she wasn't going to let it slide. Then the weight of it began to settle over the crowd. The terminal was no stranger to chaos, missed flights, lost baggage, delayed connections, but this was different. This was something people wouldn't just forget. At the back of the queue, a young airport security trainee named David Carter watched the scene unfold as his stomach twisted in unease. He had heard stories about Karen before, whispers among the staff about her attitude toward certain passengers, how she could make people feel so unwelcome without ever raising her voice. But this was something else entirely. His training told him to remain neutral, to leave customer disputes to the judgment of senior staff. But his gut told him something was seriously wrong. He glanced around to see a few of the airport employees exchanging uncertain glances. No one seemed willing to step in. Not yet. With a slow, exasperated breath, Samantha turned away from Karen, her hands gripping the edges of the counter as if to hold herself to earth. She was stuck now in this foreign city, unable to legally get on a plane. That knowledge felt like a ton of bricks pressing down upon her. Yet, one thing was certain, she was far from defeated. Not by a long shot. For several unbearable seconds, Samantha didn't move. The remains of her passport sat on the counter like some macabre joke, the once official document now no better than worthless scraps. The airport around her kept going, announcements droning over the speakers, suitcases rolling along on the polished floors. But for her, the world had narrowed to this moment. Then, real life snapped back. In the next moment, a security officer in a Navy uniform appeared, his interest piqued by the escalating fuss. His name tag identified him as T. Gray, and he wore the look of a man who had refereed his share of airport disputes. He regarded Samantha a moment before turning to regard Karen. "What's going on here?" His voice was level but firm. Karen straightened, her professionalism sliding back into place. "This passenger presented a fraudulent passport. I confiscated and disposed of it for security reasons." The words hit Samantha like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the man in the navy blazer from the line stepped forward. "That's not true," he said. "I saw her passport. There was nothing wrong with it." Another passenger chimed in. "And when did flight attendants have the authority to destroy documents?" Karen's face didn't even flinch. "I was following procedure." Gray blew out a sharp breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw as he took in the growing crowd of onlookers. The airport was not the place for this kind of sideshow, and it was evident things were getting out of hand. He turned to Samantha. "Miss, do you have any backup identification?" Her fingers clenched at her sides. "That was my only passport. You can check your system. I was just in London for a business trip. My flight was booked in advance. I've traveled internationally before. There's nothing fake about my documents." Gray nodded, absorbing her words. He wasn't the kind of man to rush judgment. "All right, let's get this sorted out. Come with me." Karen stepped in. "She shouldn't be allowed through. We have procedures." Gray lifted a hand to silence her. "I'll handle it." The shift in control was subtle, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Karen pursed her lips, clearly unhappy, but she said nothing. Samantha followed Gray past the counter, her steps measured. Behind her, the crowd was still watching. Some were still recording. Whatever happened next wouldn't stay quiet for long. They went to a side office, away from public view. Inside, Gray motioned her to sit. The space was small, filled with desks, monitors, and shelves stacked with files. A younger security officer, David, hovered near the doorway, observing keenly. Gray sat opposite her. "I need to check your identity. I can pull your travel history, but without your passport, this gets complicated." Samantha straightened herself with a deep breath. "I understand, but in the first place, this should never have happened." Gray nodded slowly, but before he could speak, David came forward. "I think we need to see what's on security footage," he said. Gray furrowed his brow. "Why?" David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because I've seen Karen do things like this before. Not like this exactly, but..." He glanced at Samantha. "I think she assumed something about you before she even checked your documents." Samantha's jaw tightened. She had seen that assumption in Karen's eyes the moment she approached the counter. Gray studied David a moment, then let out a sigh. "All right, let's check the footage." As he turned to his computer, Samantha sat back, her heart pounding. She wasn't fighting for herself anymore. If what David said was true, this was bigger than one flight, one airport. And it wasn't over yet. Gray's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the feed from the surveillance cameras near the check-in desk. Samantha sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped together in her lap, willing herself to remain calm. David stood beside Gray, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The screen flickered, showing the terminal from many different angles. They watched as Samantha approached the counter and began handing over her documents. Karen's expression barely changed in the beginning, but then there was a slight pause, a hesitation, so to say. The footage didn't have sound, but Samantha could still hear the woman's dismissive tone in her head. Then the stomach-twisting moment came. Karen looked from passport to Samantha. The action, subtle a compression of lips, a reaching of a decision, a second later the tearing in half. Gray blew air out his nostrils. "Well, that's something." David folded his arms over his chest. "She didn't even take time to study that before destroying it." Samantha hunched forward. "Go further back than that. Anyone else get that sort of treatment from her?" Gray clicked back through it. Passenger after passenger stepped up to the counter, but Karen barely glanced at their documents before waving them through. She smiled at some, not others, but at no time did she spend more than a few seconds over their passports. Then Samantha. Gray sighed softly, his hand rubbing at the bridge of his nose. "This isn't looking so good." David turned to glance at him. "You don't say." Samantha's chest clenched. Of course, this whole thing seemed fishy at the start, but seeing it unfold before her eyes was different. Gray turned to her again. "All right, this is what's going to happen. I'll escalate this to my supervisor. We'll need an official statement from you, and you should probably contact your embassy about your passport." Samantha's stomach sank. "How long does that take?" Gray's face said it all. Days, maybe longer. Her fingers dug into her palms. She didn't have days. She had meetings to attend, obligations to keep. But for now, she was stuck. David said nothing until he hesitated over what he had to say next. "We should check whether there were prior complaints against her." Gray nodded. "I'll do that." He regarded Samantha with equanimity. "You got anyone you can call?" Her jaw flexed. "Yeah, but I'd rather just handle it myself." Gray didn't argue. "All right, sit tight, I'll be back." As he left the room, Samantha leaned back in her chair. She had walked into the airport expecting a routine trip home. Now, she was at the center of something much bigger, and it was only getting started. Samantha drummed her fingers on the desk, forcing her mind to work. She couldn't just sit around and wait. If she had learned one thing in business, it was that control belonged to those who took action. David stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the doorway like he expected trouble. "You sure you don't want to call someone? This could get ugly." She breathed out slowly. "If I call my lawyer, it escalates immediately. I need to see how they handle this first." David nodded, but didn't look convinced. Minutes ticked by before Gray returned. His face was a mask, but Samantha didn't like the set of his shoulders. He let out a slow breath, dropping a file onto the desk. "She's got a history." Samantha straightened. David leaned forward. "How bad?" Gray flipped open the file. "There have been multiple complaints about Karen in the past year. Most were dismissed. Rude behavior, unnecessary delays, but nothing concrete enough to justify action." He glanced at Samantha. "Until now." She swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. Of course, there had been others. Gray continued with, "There was one case similar to this. A passenger accused her of deliberately causing an issue with their boarding pass. He claimed she singled him out, but since there was no proof, it went nowhere." David frowned. "But now we have proof." Gray nodded. "And it's already spreading. Somebody leaked the video online. It's blowing up." Samantha's pulse quickened. That changed everything. Gray rubbed his temple. "Corporate is aware. They're going to want this contained." Samantha's jaw clenched. "Contained?" Gray sighed. "They'll play like they are investigating, but what they truly want is to make this disappear." David shook his head. "That is not going to happen, not this time." Samantha's phone vibrated. She looked down. Messages flooded in from friends and colleagues, even strangers. The video was everywhere now. Gray watched her carefully. "Look, I don't know what your game is, but if you push this, things will get messy." She met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "They already are." Gray studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see how far this goes." Something had changed in the atmosphere of the airport. This was no longer a routine travel spot. It was a pressure cooker, and Samantha was right at the middle. Outside this small security office, people moved with a different kind of energy. She felt it in the way employees whispered to one another, in the way some passengers stole glances at her, as if recognizing her from that video that had already made rounds online. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, another notification. She ignored them. David leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "So, what's next? You waiting on corporate to spin this, or you making the first move?" Samantha slowly exhaled. "They think they can quietly sweep it under the rug, but I want to see how they react first." Gray was still behind his desk, eyeing her closely. "You should know corporate just sent a regional manager to handle this. They don't want this turning into a PR nightmare." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "They're too late." Gray quirked a slight smile but said nothing. He jerked his head toward the door. "They'll want to talk to you, soon." David pushed off the wall. "You trust them?" Gray hesitated a beat. "I trust them to protect their bottom line. Whether that works in your favor or not depends on how much pressure they feel." Samantha soaked it in. This was business. And business, at its root, was all about leverage, which she had now. The question was, how far was she willing to take this? A sharp knock on the door made them all turn. A woman in a dark navy suit stepped inside, her expression tight but controlled. She looked like someone who had spent years smoothing over corporate disasters. "Miss Wilson," she said with a practiced smile. "I'm Andrea Cole, Regional Director for Passenger Relations. I'd like to speak with you privately." Samantha didn't budge. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." Andrea's smile never wavered, but something behind her eyes shifted. "I understand you're upset, and I want to assure you that we take incidents like this very seriously." Samantha held her gaze. "Is that so?" Andrea coughed into her hand. "We are conducting a full internal review. We want to make things right." Samantha cocked her head slightly. "Define right." Andrea had hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but Samantha had caught it. "This was a severe lapse in judgment," Andrea continued. "Karen Davis has been placed on immediate administrative leave while we investigate." David scoffed under his breath. "Convenient." Samantha didn't bat an eye, but she did agree. This wasn't about accountability. This was damage control. Andrea regarded her. "We'd like to offer compensation for the inconvenience caused." Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. There it was. A payout. A quiet settlement masked as an apology. She leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you something, Andrea. If no one had filmed what happened, would we be having this conversation?" For the first time, Andrea's composure faltered. Samantha didn't need an answer. She already knew it. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Andrea's smile was still in place, but it had lost its warmth. Samantha had seen this kind of corporate maneuvering before, diplomatic, rehearsed, designed to contain fallout rather than fix the real problem. Andrea clasped her hands in front of her. "Miss Wilson, I understand your frustration. Our goal is to make sure every passenger is treated fairly and with respect." Samantha leaned back into her chair, unimpressed. "That didn't happen today." Andrea inhaled through her nose, choosing her words carefully. "That's why we want to make it right. Compensation is standard in situations like this." David let a low chuckle. "Situations like this?" Andrea looked over briefly at him and turned back to Samantha. "A financial settlement plus the cost of your lost passport and a first-class ticket on any future flight of your choice." Samantha studied her. They were throwing money at the problem, hoping she'd take it and walk away. She had no doubt they'd issue a neatly worded statement, something vague about company values and ongoing improvements. Then in a few weeks it would all be forgotten. Karen would get a slap on the wrist, maybe a transfer, maybe a brief suspension, but nothing would change. Samantha breathed in slowly, her resolve coming into play. "No." Andrea blinked. "Excuse me? I am not interested in settling for a quiet payout." The room tightened. Gray sat behind his desk, not saying anything, but David still turned to her in approval. Andrea didn't smile or furrow her brow, but her posture stiffened. "Miss Wilson, this is a good settlement. I definitely think you should reconsider." Samantha tilted her head an inch. "Is that a threat?" Andy's smile reappeared, this time forced. "Of course not, but these matters are best resolved quickly, with little disruption." Sam held her stare. "To whom?" Silence. And then Andy let out the breath. "What do you want?" At last, this was where it got real. Samantha crossed her arms. "A public statement, a real one. Acknowledge your fault. Acknowledge what happened. And I want to know what changes you're enacting to stop this from ever happening again." Andrea's jaw tightened. "That's not how these things work." "Then change how they work." The air in the room was thick with tension. Samantha could see the calculation in Andrea's eyes, the cost-benefit analysis playing out in real time. Finally, Andrea sighed. "I'll have to discuss this with corporate." Samantha nodded. "You do that." Andrea gave a tight-lipped smile and stood. "I'll be in touch." She strode out head high as David let out a low whistle. "Well, that was fun." Gray spoke finally. "You sure about this?" Samantha's voice didn't falter. "Absolutely. This wasn't just about her anymore, and she wasn't backing down." The moment Andrea left the room, Samantha felt the weight of what she'd just done settle in. She had thrown away an easy resolution, a quick payout that would have let her move on, but that wasn't why she was here. This wasn't just about her anymore. David let out a low chuckle. "You realize they're going to fight you on this, right?" Samantha met his gaze. "Let them." Gray let out a breath and rubbed the back of his neck. "Corporate isn't used to passengers pushing back. They're going to stall, delay, and do everything they can to make you give up." Samantha nodded, already expecting it. "Then I'll make sure they can't ignore it." David grinned. "So you're going public." She didn't respond immediately. Her phone buzzed again. More messages, more notifications. The video was still going viral. People were outraged. Comment sections were flooded with similar stories. It wasn't an isolated incident. She turned to Gray. "How long do you think Karen's worked here?" Gray thought a moment. "At least 10 years, long enough to know better." Samantha pursed her lips, and long enough to think she could get away with it. Gray said nothing, yet said it all with his quiet. The knock on the door spun them around. A young assistant no older than 25 peered inside. Nervous was her game face. Sorry to interrupt, but they just pulled Karen off the floor." David shot his eyebrow high. "Fired?" The woman hesitated. "I don't know, but they took her badge." Samantha's stomach tightened. It was a small victory, but she wasn't naive enough to think that meant accountability. Gray leaned back in his chair. "Looks like corporate's feeling the heat." Samantha nodded. "Good, but that's not enough." David grinned. "You're really not letting this go, are you?" She met his gaze. "Would you?" He smirked, but didn't argue. Samantha stood, her decision fully formed. "They want this to go away quietly. I'm going to make sure it doesn't." David exhaled. "This is going to get messy." She grabbed her phone. "Then let's make it worth it." This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The airport is no longer a transit point, but a battle. News of this incident spread crazily out of control. Reactions started pouring in social media, and significant news outlets had already started their story pickup. Samantha was not just another passenger. She symbolized something much greater. Andrea had called twice, and Samantha ignored both. She knew what would come next, a third call. This time, Gray slid the phone across the desk toward her. "It's corporate. They're done playing." She stared at the screen for a moment, then answered. "Miss Wilson," a smooth voice greeted her. "Not Andrea. Someone higher up." "I'm Mark Reynolds, VP of Operations. I'd like to offer my personal apology for today's unfortunate events." Samantha didn't respond. He continued, his tone measured. "We recognize that mistakes were made, and we're prepared to issue a formal statement acknowledging the error." A pause. "But," Samantha pressed. Mark exhaled. "But we'd appreciate your cooperation in keeping this situation from escalating further. We're willing to discuss compensation and ensure a swift resolution." There it was again. The same game. Different player. Samantha slumped back in her chair. "Let me be clear, Mr. Reynolds. I'm not interested in a payout. I'm interested in real accountability." A silence stretched out between them. "We are handling the situation internally," he finally said. "That's not enough." Another pause, this time longer. Then Mark did something unexpected. "We're willing to make changes, Miss Wilson," he said quietly. "But you need to tell me, what do you want?" Samantha blinked. She hadn't expected that. For the first time in hours, she'd let herself breathe. "You want to make this right?" she said slowly. "Then prove it. Issue the statement. Not just about me, but about everyone this has happened to." Mark hesitated. "You're asking for a lot. You can afford it." A beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, he chuckled softly. "You remind me of someone I used to work for." Samantha didn't smile. She waited. Finally, Mark let his breath out. "All right, we'll do it. But this conversation never happened." She let her breath out. "Fine, as long as the statement does." They hung up. Gray and David stared at her. David grinned. "So, you won?" Samantha shook her head. "Not yet." Her phone buzzed. A new notification. "Breaking news. Airline issues public apology. Announces internal review of discrimination complaints." David whistled. "Now you did." Samantha let the weight of it settle in. The fight wasn't over. Not really. But for today, she had done something that mattered. She stood, gripping her bag. "I have a flight to catch." Gray smirked. "They better give you the best seat on the plane," David laughed. "And free champagne." Samantha smiled for the first time in hours. She didn't need champagne. She had already won.